Hello, today we're going to explore schizophrenia. As you know, schizophrenia is a psychotic disorder. And when someone experiences a psychotic disorder, they lose contact with reality. They have difficulty telling the difference between what's real and what's not real. Schizophrenia is probably the best known of all of the psychotic disorders. It can be a very disabling disorder and can have long-term consequences for an individual and that person's life. So let's explore schizophrenia a little bit. If you were to ask someone on the street what is schizophrenia, they would probably say split personality, and they would begin describing what we know to be dissociative identity disorder, or what used to be called multiple personality disorder. But of course, that's not schizophrenia. In schizophrenia, there is a kind of a split that takes place, but the split is between the person's thinking processes and their emotional experiences, and between reality and fantasy. When we think of schizophrenia, we often associate it with two of the common symptoms of schizophrenia: delusions and hallucinations. Delusions are ideas that have no basis in reality, whereas hallucinations are perceptual distortions that also have no basis in reality. Common delusions are delusions of persecution, where the person thinks others are out to harm them, and delusions of grandeur, where they believe they are famous persons, like, say, Jesus, or that they have special powers. Hallucinations are commonly auditory, where the person hears voices of people who aren't really there, or visual, where they see things that aren't there. Other sensory modalities can also be associated with hallucinations, but by far the most common are first auditory and then visual in schizophrenia. So one of the things you'll learn about in your reading about schizophrenia is the difference between positive and negative symptoms. So let's take a look at that. When we hear the term positive, we think, oh, that must be a good symptom to have. In a sense, positive symptoms are better to have than negative symptoms because they are more treatable. But in the case of schizophrenia, positive symptoms refer to what we might call pathological excesses. That is, things we do already, but they take on a distorted twist in the case of individuals with schizophrenia. Excuse me. For example, we all have thoughts, but our thoughts tend to be organized and congruent with reality. In the case of a schizophrenic individual, they have disorganized thoughts that are not in good contact with reality. Similarly, we all see things that are there and hear voices that are from people speaking to us. But in the case of schizophrenia, the individual sees things that aren't there and hears voices from people who are not there. In the case of negative symptoms, what we might say is that the individual shows pathological deficits. That is, things that we ordinarily do, the schizophrenic person stops doing or significantly does less than would be normal. An example of this would be social withdrawal, where the schizophrenic person becomes very removed from other people, interacts minimally. They may also talk very little when an effort is made to engage them in conversation. They may also experience a significant decrease in motivation and lose the ability to enjoy life's simple pleasures. These are just some of the negative symptoms that are sometimes present with schizophrenia. Schizophrenic individuals may also experience extremes in their behavior, from catatonic stupor on the one hand, where they remain still for long periods of time without speaking, and that's called mutism when that happens, to agitation, where they run around wildly and yell and scream and are very much out of control. So these are some of the ways in which schizophrenia might manifest itself in somebody suffering with this particular disorder. This week you have an opportunity to view a video, a very powerful story by Ellen Sachs, a woman who has struggled with schizophrenia throughout her life. I hope you'll watch it and really think about what she has to say, because she reminds us that we are all more than our diagnosis, and that we have more in common with one another in terms of our humanity than symptoms that might separate us based on a psychiatric diagnosis. Ellen Sachs is a brilliant legal scholar who inspires us to appreciate how it is possible, to face and deal with a serious disorder like schizophrenia, and to be able to get to a better place in life, which she has been able to do. So there's a discussion in our book about factors that might place people at greater risk for developing schizophrenia, and factors that can either bode well or poorly for prognosis. So let's talk about that just a little bit. If an individual has a sudden onset of schizophrenia, they have a better prognosis. That is, a likelihood of making more progress with the benefit of treatment than someone who has a gradual onset of schizophrenia. In the case of a gradual onset, the person may well have early signs of schizophrenia where it's not fully developed yet, but there's unusual aspects to their thinking and their emotional expression and their behavior, an odd nature to the way they adjust to life. These kinds of symptoms are called prodromal, and do suggest that individuals, once they develop a full-blown schizophrenic episode, are likely to have a poorer prognosis. If schizophrenia is precipitated by a major stressful event, those individuals also tend to have a better prognosis as well. The more positive symptoms and fewer negative symptoms an individual has, also the better their prognosis. Interestingly, schizophrenia can take many different courses. Some people may have only one schizophrenic episode, and that's it for the rest of their lives. Other people have recurrent episodes, and with each episode, their level of functioning decreases even more so. Whereas others are able to pretty much come back to the level they were functioning each time before they have another episode. And by episode, I mean when they have a schizophrenic break where they again become psychotic and lose contact with reality. There are various explanations that have been put forth to try to help us understand what might cause schizophrenia. The strongest evidence is in the biological explanation for schizophrenia. So I would like for us to talk about that one a little bit. There is evidence to suggest a genetic component to schizophrenia. And just let me say, as we're beginning to explore causes, we need to look at it from a biopsychosocial approach and realize that various factors do come together and can interact. to result in the development of schizophrenia in the individual, and it's not the same for each person. But getting back to the biological perspective for a moment, as you may be aware, if an individual with schizophrenia has an identical twin, of course they're 100% alike genetically, there's almost a 50% chance that their twin will also be schizophrenic. It's not quite 50%, but it's close. This correspondence between two identical twins for a disorder is called concordance rate. So the concordance rate for schizophrenia is really very high. The researchers have identified various gene pairs on different chromosomes that may be associated with schizophrenia, but again, it's not the same for each person. There's also strong evidence to suggest that neurotransmitter dysregulation is associated with schizophrenia, especially oversupply of dopamine in the brain of an individual with schizophrenia. What some people believe is that there are too many dopamine receptor sites on dopamine neurons, so these neurons become overstimulated and may have something to do with the production of schizophrenic symptoms. And thinking about the dopamine hypothesis for schizophrenia, there's some other evidence that ties in with that hypothesis. You may be familiar with the disorder Parkinson's disease, a neurological disorder, where the individual does not have enough dopamine in certain centers of their brain. And as a result of that, they begin to develop motor abnormalities like tremor in their hands, a shuffle gait, muscular rigidity, and things like that. So when they treat Parkinson's disease, they give them medication that increases dopamine activity in their brain. In fact, the drug is called L-Dopa, I believe, or levodopa. So this drug actually helps to relieve symptoms of schizophrenia. But if the person gets too much of the drug, then they start having symptoms that look like schizophrenia. So here we see dopamine levels in somebody without schizophrenia, if they get too high, can cause them to have symptoms that look like schizophrenia. Also, when individuals take medication for schizophrenia, which lowers their dopamine levels, they can begin to develop side effects that look like Parkinson's disease. Another piece of evidence has to do with amphetamine drug abusers. If you recall, amphetamine drives up dopamine levels in certain areas of the brain. And in the case of amphetamine abuse, if the amphetamine levels get too high, the person may actually develop an amphetamine psychosis that looks like schizophrenia. So all of these pieces of information help to support the idea of the possibility that dopamine has something to do with schizophrenia, and that it does seem to be an oversupply, and medications that are taken for the treatment of schizophrenia help to decrease dopamine levels in the brain. We'll come back to talking about those medications in just a few moments. No one really has identified any other possible causes of schizophrenia that have as much evidence as biological causes. But I would like to talk about something interesting in the family psychology literature as it relates to schizophrenia. Not so much in looking at it as a cause, but as a factor that may contribute to the development of schizophrenic symptoms because of the stress involved, and also why it's important to address this particular issue in trying to decrease the risk of relapse when somebody has gotten help for their schizophrenia. Say they go in the hospital, they take medication, they're stabilized, and now they're going home. So this interesting phenomenon is what in the family psychology literature is called expressed emotion, or EE. When we hear about expressed emotion, we might think, well, we're talking about the expression of love and warm feelings and that kind of thing. But one of the things you'll appreciate about expressed emotion when you read about it in our book is that it has to do with negative emotion that's expressed in families associated with conflict in the family. And researchers have found that in families where there's a high level of expressed emotion, when schizophrenic individuals return home, they're at greater risk for relapse than those who are able to return to more supportive family environments. This points to the importance of having non-medical professionals involved in the treatment of individuals with schizophrenia, along with medical professionals who can monitor the medication, so that situational factors like the family environment can also be addressed in helping the person to have a greater chance of a positive response to treatment and recovery when they return to their home environment. Before getting into talking about medication for the treatment of schizophrenia further, I did want to mention a model that can help us to understand schizophrenia that has a fairly strong appeal, and it's called the diathesis stress model. According to the diathesis stress model, if a person has a predisposition or diathesis toward developing schizophrenia, then they will be at greater risk for that to happen. And when their stress level gets to a certain point, it may actually trigger a psychotic episode when the individual will have full-blown schizophrenic symptoms. If an individual has a low diathesis for schizophrenia, then they will be less likely to become schizophrenic and will require a higher level of stress to produce schizophrenic symptoms, if at all. So, working within the diathesis stress model, we could probably say that there are some people who, no matter how stressful life becomes for them, they're not going to develop schizophrenic symptoms because they just don't have the predisposition for it. They might develop other symptoms, say of depression or anxiety or something else, but not likely schizophrenic symptoms. But if the diathesis is high, say there's a lot of schizophrenia running in the family, or an identical twin has, puts their twin at greater risk, that sort of thing, then it may require less stress to actually trigger a psychotic episode in someone who is schizophrenic. The age of onset of schizophrenia tends to be in late adolescence to early adulthood. So it's very rare to find someone who's in middle to later age having their first episode of schizophrenia. If someone were to become psychotic later in life, clinicians would probably be looking carefully at possible other causes, like some kind of organic brain process, for example, or something caused by drug abuse, before making a diagnosis of schizophrenia, because it would be much less probable. Getting back to discussing medication a little bit further in the treatment of schizophrenia, I wanted to talk about how antipsychotic drugs seem to work in the brain, and then the two major categories of antipsychotic drugs. So back in the 50s, they accidentally discovered that drugs, which now are called phenothiazine antipsychotic drugs, actually help to relieve symptoms of schizophrenia. I say accidentally because they were exploring the use of the drug Thorazine for other purposes and found that it had this therapeutic effect in individuals with schizophrenia. Well, this was a revolutionary discovery in the field of psychiatry because up to that point, there really weren't any drugs that effectively relieved schizophrenic symptoms. And probably more than anything else, led to a significant decrease in the number of patients who were in state mental hospitals. Those medications have been around for a long time, the neuroleptic medications, and are still available today and are effective in the relief of psychotic symptoms. But they do have some troubling side effects associated with them. And the most troublesome of the side effects would be what's called tardive dyskinesia, which you'll read about in your book. And sadly, these side effects tend to become permanent, and the person has various kinds of uncontrollable movements around their facial muscles, their mouth and tongue, where they may protrude their tongue out, and they may also make sort of writhing kinds of movements with their hands. You are more likely to see these symptoms in individuals who are older, who have been on high doses of neuroleptic medications for many years. More recently, a newer generation of antipsychotic drugs has been developed, and these drugs are called well, they go by different names, but you'll see them referred to as second generation antipsychotics is one of the names they go by. And the thing about these drugs is that they have fewer side effects and probably greater therapeutic effects in helping individuals with schizophrenia. So if someone were able to take one of the newer generation of antipsychotic drugs that are also called atypical antipsychotic drugs, they would probably have a better chance of having greater improvement with fewer side effects than the older drugs, which are still around and are still used in the treatment of schizophrenia. I think that's pretty much what I'd wanted to have a chance to go over with you today on schizophrenia. And again, I hope that you really enjoy the video by Ellen Sachs. It's a touching, moving video. It's one of my very favorites in this course, and I'm glad that I have the opportunity to share it with you. That's all for now. Bye.